Not surprisingly, Paul appears to have crafted his pastoral letters to the various congregations with which he worked using the accepted conventions of his day. We do too. There's a reason you start your letters, "Dear so-and-so," and end with "Yours truly." You do that because contemporary conventions and expectations of letter writing demand it. That's how I know I'm reading a letter and not a story, because it begins "Dear so-and-so" and not "It was a dark and stormy night." Moreover, the form of the letter usually reflects its purpose. If you get a letter that begins "My darling dearest," you have one set of expectations for the letter, but if it begins "Dear occupant," you have a very different set of expectations. So it was in Paul's day too. If you were writing a persuasive piece to a congregation, as Paul typically does, the congregation would have a certain set of expectations about how that letter would proceed. Paul knew that and consequently crafted his letters accordingly. Let me explain. Paul's culture and context was steeped in Greek thought and expression. When it comes to the forms and conventions of argumentations, the Greeks, going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, articulated patterns and conventions of persuasive speaking and argumentation, which they called rhetoric, and which in the Middle Ages constituted, along with grammar and logic, the trivium, the first three of the seven so-called liberal arts that educated persons were required to know and master. Aristotle coalesced and condensed these rhetorical conventions of his day in his work called Rhetoric. And that work not only influenced speaking and writing in Paul's day, but Paul himself, in his letters, demonstrates not only a knowledge of those conventions, but a dependence upon them. Consequently, an understanding of the conventions and patterns of ancient rhetoric goes a long way toward helping us understand Paul's method of argumentation in his letters. Conversely, ignoring those rhetorical conventions when interpreting Paul's letters can lead us to miss the flow and logic of Paul's argument, and consequently to misinterpret what he is saying. And so let me summarize briefly, if I may, the basic rhetorical framework, both used by Paul and expected by Paul's audience when they read his letters. Aristotle identified three factors or steps involved in persuasive argument: ethos, establishing a credible relationship with the audience; logos, the logic of the arguments, the case the speaker or writer is making; and pathos, the so what of the argument, moving the audience to respond to the case that has been made in the argument. Aristotle went on further to identify three different types of rhetoric depending on its context and purpose. One, forensic rhetoric, legal rhetoric in which the speaker or writer either accuses or defends; deliberative rhetoric, legislative rhetoric in which the speaker or writer attempts to persuade the audience of something; and epidictic rhetoric, public rhetoric in which the speaker or writer engages in either praise or blame in terms of continuity or discontinuity with communal values. To put it succinctly, these three kinds of rhetoric attempt to answer for the audience three different questions. Is it just? Forensic. Is it expedient? Deliberative. Is it praiseworthy? Epidictic. Now, it doesn't take much work in reading through Paul's letters. That is, if we read them like real letters and not just as a repository of sayings or aphorisms to extract for our own purposes, to realize that Paul is employing these standard rhetorical conventions in his writings. To be sure, it's not always easy to tell which kind of rhetoric Paul is using in a given letter. For example, Hans-Dieter Betz, in his Hermeneia commentary on Galatians, describes Galatians as an example of forensic rhetoric, while George Kennedy, in his book New Testament Interpretation Through Rhetorical Criticism, describes the same letter as deliberative rhetoric. Betz arguing that Paul is engaging in self-defense of his apostleship, and Kennedy arguing that Paul is attempting to persuade the Galatians of the validity of his gospel. Now, the fact that Paul does not slavishly follow rhetorical conventions but adapts them to his needs and purposes, explains why scholars often disagree over which type of rhetoric Paul is employing in a letter. Paul, it seems, will combine elements of different rhetorical types in the same letter if it suits his purposes to do so. But having said that, paying attention to the rhetorical features of Paul's letters helps us to understand the internal logic and flow of the argument Paul is making, so that we do not dip into Paul's letters at random and unmoor his statements from the carefully crafted rhetorical argument Paul is constructing, and then give his statements extracted from their context weight Paul himself never intended. Paul's epistle to the Galatians is a case in point. In ancient rhetoric, speeches or formal writings were expected to have certain structure consisting of 6 parts. First, the introduction or ethos, in which the speaker or writer seeks to establish a relationship with the audience, thus gaining a hearing. Second, the narration, in which the speaker or writer narrates the events related to the central issue. Third, the proposition, in which the speaker or writer summarizes the central thesis to be proved. Fourth, the confirmation, the logos, in which the speaker or writer sets out the logical arguments of the presentation. Fifth, the refutation, in which the speaker or writer anticipates and refutes the opponent's arguments. And then sixth, the conclusion, the pathos, in which the speaker or writer recapitulates the basic points and evokes a response. Now, in ancient rhetoric, these 6 parts are given Latin names: exordium, narratio, propositio, probatio, refutatio, peroratio. These 6-part rhetorical structures fit Paul's letter to the Galatians, for example, to a T. First, the prescript, the introduction, followed by the exordium, the narratio, the propositio, the probatio, the exhortatio, and the peroratio. I've given you the references in Galatians there for you on the screen so that you can see what passages are associated with each. Now, this is not accidental. Paul is following the rhetorical conventions of his day in crafting his letter to the Galatians in a way that both supported the case he was making and resonated with his audience, who would have expected just such a structure in a letter intended to present an argument and make a case. Furthermore, Paul's audience would have immediately recognized what Paul was doing because they had seen it before. But we come along 2,000 years later with different letter-writing conventions and expectations, and unaware that Paul is crafting his letter according to a specific pattern and structure, treat the letter like it is merely a collection of unconnected thoughts and ideas from which we can extract what we wish for our own purposes without doing violence to the integrity of the letter. But it is not, and we cannot, miss the rhetorical structure and style of Galatians, and you will likely misunderstand, misinterpret, and even misapply Paul's argument in the letter. Now, does that mean that I must become an expert in ancient Greek rhetoric to read and understand Paul's letters? No, but somebody does. And thankfully there are scholars who do just that. The best of the standard academic commentaries on Paul's letters will always address these rhetorical features of his letters. So be guided in your study of Paul's epistles by these scholars and commentators who pay attention not only to what Paul says, but to the way in which he says it. Doing so will help you, as Paul counseled Timothy, to orthotomunda ton logon tis aletheus, rightly divide the word of truth. Till next time, take care. God bless.